Hi everyone, welcome to a new episode of Carolyn Talks. This is the YouTube channel / podcast where I, your host, Carolyn Hines, film culture critic and journalist, speak to film creatives around the world about their work, the industry, and what inspires them. And today I'm very happy to be joined by filmmaker Lena MacDonald to talk about her documentary, Betrayal, which I said that so dramatically, but I think it needs to be said dramatically. It's about Cindor Reeves, who is known in a lot of international communities as the man who betrayed his brother-in-law, Charles Taylor, the former president and warlord of Liberia. So right now, as in the film, you will know the film is about Cindor basically in hiding because he was kicked out of Canada, for shame, Canada, in 2015, in 2015. Right.
2015 is our first time we shoot after he's left Canada. Yes.
Right. So he'd been kicked out of Canada after his refugee status was denied, and he is in Ghana. The film is set in Ghana, where he's telling his story, how he was introduced to Charles Taylor. And but before we get into the film, first of all, thank you, Lena, for talking with me and for making, I think, such a fascinating film about such, I think, a fascinating man. So thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you. So my first question, actually, Lena, I was looking up a little bit of your info. So you've been previously showing at HotDocs. You had a film in 2015, ironically, called Mom and Me, and that film was about that. I believe it took 10 years for you to make because you were looking for your mom and you were like on this search to find your mom and your identity through your mother through your family. And I kind of saw a parallel between that and Betrayal, because there's something in Betrayal that Cindor keeps repeating over and over, and is that he saw Charles Taylor as a father figure. And I got the sense that he was looking for a father figure and he was looking for a father. So Charles Taylor was introduced by his own sister, Agnes, at a time where he was most susceptible to be influenced by someone like Charles. And I kind of saw that as a correlation between you looking for your own mother in your first film. So I want to actually start an interview there about the concept of people on a search for something as a theme in your films.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. I think, I don't think I would have necessarily known out of the gate when I first got interested in Cindor's story that there were going to be such parallels. And of course, the contexts are entirely different, but it's so nice that you've noticed that because I first read about Cindor's story as his immigration case was concluding here in Canada and finding out that he was losing and being separated from his wife and children who were granted status. And I, was talking with my dad about it. And at the same time, I was finishing Mom and Me. I wasn't finished it yet. So it took me a little while to track him down. And then we began many years long conversation before I even picked up a camera to shoot with him. And over the course of those years were the years that I was wrapping up Mom and Me and releasing it. And he, of course, watched it. But we were having conversations about what it means to love difficult people, what it means to grow up around violence. My mom, of course, had been homeless and a drug user. And apart from that, my dad has a checkered past as a powerful organized crime guy. He was many things, but he was also that. So even though the context and the stakes, of course, were just, so much more extreme for Cindor, I could identify with the idea of, what it means to be a snitch, of dance with the one who brung you versus the greater good, of loving really difficult people and still appreciating all the gifts they've given you, even though, they're difficult or perpetrators. So yeah, I think for me, that is a really big part of it. And then the other thing that Cindor and I actually have is a major parallel, and I think drew us to one another and to the film, is that we in part found our way through reading and through media. We both found our sense of justice and our sense of knowing of the world, through, living in these kind of crazy, semi-violent experiences, each our own. We both were really drawn to the news and to books and really related to one another about that. So thanks for seeing that. That's true.
Yeah, like he was because the way he just kept talking about, I saw him as a father, and he was the person who taught me. Because the other thing that I thought was really interesting is that Charles is the person who introduced Cindor to his love of books and his love of reading and to disseminating information and thinking critically and to seeing the world as a broader concept outside of his first in Maryland, where Cindor grew up, but then in Monrovia in the main city. And he started to see this world open up through books because of Taylor. And I thought that was such an interesting thing because it's like, where it's like you talk about loving difficult people, but it's not only loving difficult people, it's about the mentorship that you receive from people, where sometimes like people see their teachers and their mentors as these godlike figures in their life because they're the one who opened them up to higher learning, and they think that they owe everything they are to this person because of that education. And I want to talk about that a bit because because I just found like the way that Cindor thinks and the way that he sees the world was because of where he grew up in Maryland, but also because of this perception he had of Charles and the life he had with his sister Agnes, who was Charles's wife, and that life they had. And then that gets shattered in an instant when he realizes, oh, this person that I see as extremely intelligent, as I see extremely charismatic, as I see as extremely forward thinking, a man who believes in education, a man who believes in in the world, uses that to harm people. So I want to talk about that because I think a lot of that the film is called Betrayal, and the thing is that people called Cindor the betrayer. I actually see Charles as the betrayer because he broke Cindor's trust. He broke everything that Cindor saw in him. He broke this idea of what a father is, this idea of what a mentor is, this idea of what a friend is. And I was like, nah, the ultimate betrayal was Charles turning out to be this absolute monster and gaslighting Cindor and the entire world. But I want to talk about that theme first, but I want to talk about just the concept of how the person who educated him is the person who is the one who led to his own downfall because of the education he gives Cindor.
Yeah,
that fascinates me.
I agree. I think it's really fascinating. I think like, what they call it, like sort of master's tools, like that essentially, as his mentor, Taylor equipped Cindor with the means and the mechanism and the insight to actually turn state's witness on him, right? It's because of the education that Taylor gives Cindor that Cindor is able to act the way he acts. I asked him that, and I think he would give Taylor a lot of that credit. I think some of the credit is down to Cindor and his sense of like he is an inborn moral actor, right? I think that I think there's something there where maybe he was always going to be somebody restless, or who had a kind of angst to do the right thing, a restlessness to do the right thing, but for sure. He wouldn't have been in the position to turn state's witness and inform on Taylor and help bring about the end of those civil wars or Taylor's case if he hadn't have gotten the education Taylor gave him. So certainly that is a kind of an irony in the film, and it's also important, and I think what I really love about Cindor is that he's able to acknowledge that, right? He's a really deep thinker. And I think he sees himself in the world really clearly. He may not be perfect, but I think he's a really clear thinker. And I think I always appreciated that about him. And that was one of the things that early on I thought, this is a really fascinating, interesting, smart, thoughtful person who surely has some interesting things to say about that. And I think it's great that he can sort of like, I think he still has some loving feelings for Taylor, and he says over and over again, he was always that father figure, cooked for us, he thought of us, he was, he hugged us and was loving, but at the same time, he was this kind of scary boogeyman on the other side once he left the house.
Yeah, I got the sense that Cindor is still trying to rationalize and figure out how the person that cooked a meal for him, who cooked for him, cleaned the house, that once he stepped outside the door did a complete 180. I think I got that sense that Cindor is still trying to rationalize, that he's still trying to figure out like how, but that's the thing about human nature. We are so. I've been talking about this again a lot a lot of recent interviews too, where like human beings are so complex. There's so many sides to us. We are so unpredictable. Like I think one of the truest things about human beings is that we're never fully able to understand human behavior and what human capability is. You know, what being a what we are, the levels of which we're able to sink or rise to, whether it be to evil or to like the best of human nature. And I think Cindor is still trying to figure it out. He's still trying to wrap his head around that, because he's like, because I think that's one of the reasons he keeps repeating about what kind of man Taylor was to him as a father figure, because he's like, but how? I can't figure this out. Because it's like, how you can have like parents who are abusive to their kids and to their wives and to their families indoors, but once they get outside, they're the perfect definition of what a parent and what a husband and loving spouse is.
Yeah, so this is the inverse of that, right? And you know what? Another thing, you know, this is a bit of a spoiler, but you know, one of the things that Cindor keeps saying throughout the film is, you know, that even later, once Cindor has turned state's witness on Charles, Charles is still advising him. He says, "Hey, these white people, they're going to use you, and when they're done with you, they're going to drop you." And that is exactly what happened, right? But even as Cindor has turned on him, Taylor is still advising him. He's still offering his wisdom, right? And so it's, yeah, I'm sure that's really difficult for Cindor to navigate. I think he still, I do believe he feels good about his decision. I feel like he, you know, knows that he did the right thing. But, you know, certainly he has paid a very high price for it.
He has, and he kind of says that at the end where he's like, "I'll never do it again." And I understood. I'm like, boy, I'm with you. Like, you don't regret the decision, but like, it should, like, you were like, yeah, I'm not gonna put myself in that position again. And that makes sense, because he's also been betrayed by the government. He's been betrayed by the very people he helped, who relied on him for information, who he put himself in danger to help and to betray his, not only Charles Taylor, but also his sister Agnes, you know, and to the rest of the family that they had in Liberia, and to the friends. And like, he put himself into into no man's land to help the U.S. government and the Canadian government and England, because MI6 was involved, and the UN and all of these international organizations and bodies. And they left him floundering, and like, he was betrayed by them too. And it's just like, of course you want to do it again. Like, why would you? What is the incentive for you personally? Because you're separated from your family, while the same people betray you are, they're living their lives with their own families too. You know, getting to call themselves heroes and international diplomats and stuff. And it's like,
exactly,
you're hiding in a hole.
So there's a few things there for me. You know, first of all, I like to think of Cindor, I always say, like, he's a bit of a kingmaker, right? Like you say just now, that, you know, anybody who had a case, you know, used him as an asset, not just against Taylor, but against other notorious arms dealers, against other warlords. So, you know, he was involved in multiple cases. And of course, everybody got their conviction. Everybody got their articles. They got their book deals, you know. And what has he gotten, right? And so for you to point that betrayal is operating at all these different levels within the film is funny. This was just always our temp title. But at the end of it all, we didn't feel like we could find another better title, like another better way to talk about what happened here, you know, because we do feel that Cindor was betrayed.
I think the other title could have been The Betrayal of Cindor Reeves, and that all fix a whole lot of different scenarios. And that's what I was like, the betrayal of Cindor Reeves. Yeah, the betrayal of Cindor, of his brother-in-law and his sister and his people, but also the betrayal of Cindor Reeves by all of these international organizations and governments and all of these things, you know. And I would say even the culture, because the thing is like, he knows what Charles Taylor's capable of. Not only just Charles Taylor, he's seen it, and he saw what was done to Sierra Leone. You know, how he destroyed Sierra Leone. Like, the film Blood Diamonds is influenced a large part because of Cindor Reeves' work, because he revealed the blood diamond trade and how Sierra Leone was being exploited by Charles Taylor and his people to use their diamonds to fund their war and all of these things. And again, even people outside of the immediate investigation, like when I was watching the film, I was like, I thought about, again, films like Blood Diamonds. I was like, even outside of immediate investigation, Hollywood itself benefited from that.
Of course.
Like, you know,
Cindor is the central subject of the book that became the film Blood Diamonds.
Right.
It's down to Cindor. You know, again, kingmaker, right? Like, and of course, nobody knows who he is, right? We have whistleblowers who are household names. He changed the world. He changed the world. He helped make historic convictions. And then, yeah, these Hollywood films. And, he is, stateless in limbo, untouchable, away from his children, lost the company of his children, his safety, So I agree. I agree with you. It's Hollywood is so many different places, people, organizations, individuals have benefited.
Mm. And because he's stateless, he's in limbo, he's living in hiding. I want to ask you how I like, people will say, why didn't you start an interview there? But I started the interview the way I did because all of this is what leads to him being where he is. And I want to ask you, how did you get to him where he is? Because the film, the way you structure the film is very interesting in that he is not he doesn't introduce himself at the beginning of the film. And usually these type of documentaries, like the person kind of like walks in shock, you introduce them and say, this is it, and then the story begins. And then literally they say, and this is my story. This is how we got here. You don't do that. You actually kind of start the film with like him talking about an assassination attempt on his life, and you give a bit more of the backstory of Liberia, talking about his life in Maryland, where he talks about his history to like the Freetown, which was the first settlement of transplanted enslaved free Black people who were sent to the African continent after abolition. And I like that he points out, he says, my grandfather, my people, I am a direct descendant of these people who were sent from African slaves in North America, and they came back to Liberia. And I think that was a very important distinction for him to make, because he was like, my people, my ancestors were taken from Africa against their will, enslaved in America. They survived that, managed to come back to Liberia, to the home continent, and I'm a direct descendant of that perseverance and that ability to survive insurmountable odds. And I think that kind of like shows like that's within him, surviving these insurmountable odds. And then he says, oh, by the way, my name is Cindor Reeves, and like things. So talk to me just about that, because I thought the introduction of him and giving that backstory of him having the sort of American transplanted upbringing within Maryland, because he talks about watching American movies, kind of eating American food and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the history is really complex, and after more than a decade in the film, like I know a little bit about it, maybe a lot about it, but I wouldn't deign to speak about it, but from a personal point of view. But I will say that when the Americo-Liberians came back to when they drew the lines and made the country that we now know as Liberia. Unfortunately, and this is like where the legacy of colonialism and violence, colonial violence comes in, is the Americo-Liberians then proceeded to rule over the indigenous folks local to there. And I think Cindor is pointing to that resilience and that perseverance, but he's also pointing to like the social structure of the country and how, at one point it was a point of pride. You wanted to be an Americo-Liberian, whereas now there's like a movement within society to reclaim your indigenous name, so it's a really complex history, and not a lot of people are aware of it, but in part, that's part of why the film points to the United States and their acts of destabilization and their machinations all along the way. All the way to the point where the U.S., at the turn of the century, loans Liberia the money to build their port, and in building their port, it allows them, of course, to exploit Liberia of their rubber at the height of their auto empire growing. So, I think it's been, there's been a relationship there all along, but it's been for whom? Right? For who does
it's always for the colonizer.
Always, exactly. So I think it was important for Cindor to both locate himself in that, and then also, I think I've watched him grow even in his relationship to that, and move towards like a more Pan-African, African kind of identity versus an Americo-Liberian identity. I'm not sure, I think he would say that today if he was sitting here with us. But yeah, no, I think it was really important because the U.S. has had their fingers meddling in Liberian politics from the very beginning, of course, because it's repatriated slaves. It's the American Colonization Society. Of course, there were emancipated, folks who wanted to, there was a movement that was pro going back and having their own country. But, I will say that there was also a fundamental piece of racism involved in the creation of Liberia and the sending back of freed slaves. I think it was both. There were people who were abolitionists who were very much for it, but then there was also the fear of white Americans about, all these free black people, and they thought, oh yeah, give them their own country, get them away from here. So there was it was a racist project from the beginning, even if there were also positive advocates for it as well, like from within the abolitionists and movements and people and communities. So yeah, I think it's really important for folks to have a little bit of that backgrounder too, without trying to make it seem like too wiki or too, much of a history lesson. It was really important that people understood that colonial history.
Yeah, because the other thing about it is like you just mentioned, and it made me think of it. I hadn't thought about it when I was watching the film, but I just thought about, how people always tell like Africans, immigrants, and refugees in North America, go back to where you come from. Go back. And then it's like, okay, they go back, but guess what? You people, the colonizers, the imperialists, the capitalists are still there all across the African continent, exploiting the indigenous people, exploiting the environment, stealing their resources, their minerals, their water, polluting the atmosphere, starting wars, political coups, because that's what happened. Like the reason Charles Taylor was able to create a military coup and oust Samuel Doe, who the president, was because he had backing by the U.S. government, was because he had backing by the CIA. So you start a civil war, exploit Liberia, and then use Sierra Leonean guerrilla fighters, turn on them because you got the backing of the U.S. government. So then,
because who benefits from destabilization like that? Private interests, right? Private interests. The colonizers, yeah. The colonizers.
And so then when the countries are destabilized, where are the people supposed to go? They flee to outside of the country, outside of the continent, and back to where you told them to come from. And it's just like, what do you want? They did go back. But because you were meddling, they have nowhere else to go but to come back. No. And then it's just it's like this cycle, and it's like you keep blaming the people. And again, like your film very smartly explains that. And if people are paying attention, they'll pick up on it, because you do talk about the political coups. You talk about, again, I mentioned Sierra Leone, but then there's other countries like Guinea. Like Guinea is just north of Liberia, and like how a lot of that, and if people are familiar with like Nigeria and Ghana, how a lot of that is leached into surrounding countries like Uganda, Congo, for goodness sakes, the DRC. That's happening in Congo and the DRC, right? That's how we have like the coltan and cobalt and copper and all these minerals being exploited, because US capitalists like Elon Musk and Samsung, and Samsung meaning South Korea, they use these minerals. China is now a neo-colonial. I was like, if your film had been set a little bit later, like closer to our present now, I'm sure you would have found a way to mention China, because China is a presence all across the African continent.
Well, we worked actually with colleagues in Sierra Leone for one of our shoots, because we hop around as Cindor moves around to different safe houses in different countries. But our colleagues in Sierra Leone were doing really amazing work, actually documenting the Chinese super trawlers that are illegally fishing in West African waters. Like it's just nonstop, right? And that's why we have, even though he's a complex character, Taylor's lawyer very rightly points out about the North-South exchange, right? And it's not just about how justice is meted out; it's also about about that exploitation. So the hammer of justice comes down for say African warlords or African war criminals, but it's actually so that we can continue exploiting you. And that's why we must ask, why does the hammer of justice not come for white war criminals, for North American war criminals, for other war criminals globally?
Benjamin Netanyahu is a war criminal.
Indeed.
He should be at The Hague.
Indeed. Yes.
Every U.S. president should have been at The Hague. Every
Yes.
single one of them. Like someone, I'm like, no, if you look at it, every single American president is a war criminal. It's almost like a prerequisite.
Yeah.
You know, and it's funny you mentioned the fish trawlers, because I saw a video recently on Instagram where not only are they doing along the African shores, they're actually starting to move towards to the Caribbean too. And the thing is, China, this is a little bit off of a segue, but not really, because Caribbean heritage is connected to Africa. China has actually been doing the same thing in the Caribbean that they've been doing in Africa. Like my country, Barbados, is in the 90s. We started a trade educational exchange deal with China, where they built our national gymnasium, which is like a big sporting place, for with the thing that we would do future trades with them. So they sent like a lot of their workers. They built it. They they provided infrastructure for it, maintenance and everything for it. And I remember it distinctly because at my primary school there was a kind of like an old school that was transformed into a dormitory for the workers, and like they were close to my primary school, so we see them getting, and like we see them there, and then like on the way down into town we see them getting ready. And now like Barbados owes a huge debt to China that we will never be able to repay, because well, interest rates and all of that, because we can't afford it. Like we're small island.
Of course. No, that's the point, and that was the case with Liberia's port, which I have a side project that I have done like a lot of investigating about Liberia's port, and it ties back to Taylor, but it goes much further than that. And like I said, you know, the U.S. loaning Liberia the money to build the port at high interest rate so that they can exploit the rubber and pay pennies on the dollar for it. So it's just you know, it's just absurd, and yeah, no, and it's not over.
Yeah, I want to. So I want us to talk a bit about how you introduce yourself to Taylor, because with everything that we've discussed, everything that he has hanging over his head, the threat of possibly being assassinated, of being left out in the cold by all of these government organizations, being away from his family. How did you get into contact with him, and how did you convince him to do this documentary? I got the sense that he's doing it because I think it was at the beginning of the film where like there's a note that says he does this in the event he gets killed. But how did you get in contact with him and convince him to do this? Because I almost felt like this was his obituary, and it sounds morbid to say that, but I had this fear like he did this really because he's like, I need someone to tell my story. I need to tell my story myself.
That is certainly how it felt when we began. So, you know, like I said, like I first, you know, got interested in his story when he was applying for asylum here in Canada. And I was following his case, and there was great coverage, you know, in Maclean's and the Star and elsewhere. And I was just incensed on his behalf that he was being denied asylum, but his wife and children were being granted it, and therefore, you know, effectively separating them. And I actually was talking about it with my dad, and I was so angry and saying, "Are you reading this? Are you listening to this?" And my dad said, "Hey, are you listening to yourself?" Because I was in the middle of wrapping up the film about my mom. And he said, "There's a story there, Lena." And so, you know, I decided to get in contact with Cindor, but by the time I decided to do that, he'd already left Canada. Mm-hmm. So I had to be vetted. I contacted some people who put me in touch with him, and then he and I began a long conversation for a number of years about the topic, about informing, about turning state's witness, about loving difficult people, as I mentioned, loving monsters, and then what happened was he was shot. And I didn't hear from him for a few weeks, a number of weeks, actually. And we normally were checking in every once in a while. And then when he was shot, he said, "Okay, you better come right now." I said, I'm going to come. He said, "You better come and hear my story because they're going to get me." So that is how the film begins. It begins at that moment where I first actually meet him, and he's had an assassination attempt on his life. And there have been a few others before and after. You know, we talk about some others in the film, but we actually left a number of them out. I spend 10 years interviewing him in different safe houses and after different threats or attempts on his life, and he discusses ones that had happened previously. I can't believe, you know, it's shaped my life. It's changed my life that I connected with him and that he was willing to talk with me and share his story. I feel very committed to helping him be resettled somewhere safely with this film, and I hope that it aids him. So we are working with an organization called PILAF, Platform to Protect Whistleblowers in Africa. and also some other Ghanaian-based whistleblower org called Washik, and a few others, and then hopefully some Canadian organizations and some British organizations to help him not be on the run anymore.
Yeah, because he was deported in 2011, and the assassination attempt, the main one that's mentioned in was in 2015, and we're in 2025. You know, this is over 15 years of being alone. Like his kids have grown up without him. You know, he and his wife separated, they got a divorce, and that makes sense. It's sad, but it makes sense because like having that legal tie to him could place her and the kids in additional danger, and he's aware of that. And it's like he says he calls them every single day, you know, and like sometimes every call isn't long or short because of the internet connection and all of these things. And it's just like, when you think about like where his life took a turn, it's just like, that's such a wild thing because he was happy as a child in Maryland, you know. And if you think about it, he's like, if his sister had never introduced him to this man, like where would he be? Like he wouldn't be in a situation. But then it's just like, if his sister hadn't done that, if he hadn't been in Charles Taylor's life, where would Liberia be now? You know,
exactly.
Where would Africa be? Where would the world? I just said, like, where would the world be? Because he's literally changed the world, like in ways that we don't even fully understand or comprehend, because it's such a big wide web, and it's like the butterfly effect. You know, one action happens here, and it affects something else that happens across the other side of the globe. And a lot of that, like, he's at the center for a lot, because like when the reference to 9/11 came, I was like, wait a minute. You know, and I'm just like, but then it's also, so not only how important he was, everything that's happening, but how everything that happens in global politics is interconnected. I always say a lot of what we see is not a coincidence at all. And one thing that happens in one place is directly tied to another thing. And I think, and so like he makes that connection, and you make that connection in the film, and like you can't help but think, but like he's such an important person, but he's on board. And it's just like, that's, I think, again, that to me, that is also one of the biggest betrayals too, where it's like he has no foundation, he's kind of adrift. And that's a betrayal of the world, you know,
and it's a stain on the record of humanitarian law. It's a stain on Canada's immigration system. It's a stain on the ICC and the special court. And, you know, even if he's had his advocates, it wasn't enough. There are more than dozens of people who are empowered to make sure this man is safe. And you know, some of the folks who did write letters and have advocated for him say, you know, he was brave and stuck his neck out at a time when nobody was willing. And he's paid such a high price. So, you know, we are at a point, you know, when people ask me, you know, along the way, as I was trying to convince people to pay attention to this film, and like, what about it was fresh? And I say, okay, well, like, what about right now in rising authoritarianism at this critical moment for humanitarian law and the ICC and its efficacy? And you know, I think it's a moment to look at both how dictators come to power, but also how their power is maintained and how these superstructure powers are maintained. And I think, you know, what prospects do we have if we can't, you know, if we can't keep our brave moral actors safe? What prospects are there for the project of international law or international justice? Or, you know, so I am, you know, I'm really hopeful, but it's hard to keep hope in today in this world.
We live in a very every day we get up and I look at my cell phone, and I'm just like, how much more? And while I was watching the film, the phrase for, I'm paraphrasing because I can never remember the exact quote, but it's like, for evil to prevail, good men must do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but there's also power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think those two phrases and quotes are interconnected.
Yeah,
you know, because the unfortunate thing is, because power corrupts absolutely, that means that whatever good the powerful has is eroded.
Yeah,
you know,
but you know, so to your first point, like, Cindor is not a good man who did nothing. He did something. He is a moral actor. These are the kinds of people we want to celebrate. These are the kind of people we want in our country. These are, you know, and you know, so for me, I think that's a really important point. And like, even though, you know, we see Cindor go through an arc of, you know, pride and despondency, you know, I think he would make the decision again to do it again. I still think he believes in justice. I still think he believes, you know, that he did the right thing. And I think he would call on all of us to do the right thing. And I think that's what we have to do right now. We have the truth. We have each other, you know, and so we have to continue to try. Otherwise, we lose. We lose it all.
Yeah, I think he would, because he is at his heart, like he believes in justice. I think the thing that he regrets the most is that he feels like he's with injustice alone. Because again, even while he was like gathering all the information that was happening, of everything that was happening in Liberia, he was alone. You know, he was technically alone because he couldn't tell his sister, because his sister was actively working with Charles Taylor to recruit young Liberian and Sierra Leone men to join their army, you know. So he couldn't tell her, he couldn't tell his family back in Maryland, because that would place them in danger. He had no friends. He had friends, but he couldn't trust that he could tell them that they could be an ally, because they might turn around and snitch on him. And then he would think, so like, and the people that he was informing for were all across the world in different countries. So anything happens, they're not gonna be immediately able to get him. You know, it took a while for him to be rescued, and the only reason they even took him out was because his life was in imminent danger.
Yeah,
like who knows how long? So it's just like, I think that's the thing he regrets. Like, he's just like, I'm just alone in all of this. You know, and like, he has no one physically beside him. Like, you were with him for 10 years talking, but a lot of that was through phone conversations, online and stuff. So like, he still had no one directly to keep him company.
No, and that's a tragedy. It's a tragedy, and I hope we can change it.
I hope so too. I hope he's able to like reconnect with his family and find safety and like be able to engage with the world, you know, because when the film starts, it says like, oh, he's in like Ghana and stuff, but then they would have to think, well, he's not there now, because like that's a risk. But I think in showing like he is in a location, it shows that he inhabits these spaces, but no one knows who he is. He's just walking through these cities and these streets like a ghost, you know?
Exactly. Yeah, no, we definitely, like, that was important for us to like get that across, that, you know, like his stuff is in bags. He's checking in and out of hotels, out of these safe houses. He's looking out the window to check to see the security of them, you know, and it's just not a way for anybody to live. He deserves to feel comfortable in his home and in his skin, because he did the right thing.
And for my last question, I want to ask you, is there anything that you filmed that you couldn't put into the film? Because like, for many times, like, sometimes there's things you can put into the film, like because of timing, and you couldn't necessarily tie it and stuff. But is there anything in the film that you filmed and that Cindor spoke about that you really wanted to put in, but you're just like, okay, it doesn't really work just for film purposes? Like, because like,
oh my God, so many. The film, we soothed ourselves by saying this really should have been a series. So, you know, there isn't a series on the books right now, but we would just say, okay, well, we're going to leave this scene for the series. We just soothe ourselves and pretend like there was an imaginary series, because it was so many beautiful, critical, smart, interesting moments, wild stories. There's a whole storyline about them using him as an asset to get to Victor Boot, the notorious arms dealer, you know, that Lord of War is based on. And so, and who was traded for Brittany Griner, and they use him in Paris to go as an asset to go get Victor Boot, and he is literally kidnapped in a van. They are watching him on the CCTV. Cindor is kidnapped in the van, and he manages to escape. And they're watching it all in the CCTV, and they say, you know what, we maybe hung him out a little bit too far on that one, you know? So we had to leave that out, whole huge storylines like that. And then I'll say that we also had to leave out some of the really touching, beautiful moments of just Cindor's humanity, him singing Nat King Cole, singing When I Fall in Love or Let's Face the Music and Dance, and just, you know, being a whole person, because we just had to keep the brass tacks. And, you know, even though there were these beautiful moments of him, also, you know, really intense moments where he cried speaking about his childhood and his mother, you know, I think we really wanted to keep focus about his present day and about his relationship with his kids. So in favor of, you know, of that, you know, we ended up having so much left on the cutting room floor. That breaks my heart, but we did the best we could.
You did, and I think you guys made a very fascinating documentary. And the way, like, kudos to you and to your editor in particular, because the way the film is cut really does make us very curious to know more about Cindor. And I think that's very important. Like, curiosity in this point is in a way to build public interest, you know, to get people curious about him and everything that's happened. Because I was thinking about it, because I did paralegal at Seneca around from, I think, 2014 to 2017. And I was thinking about it, and I'm like, yeah, I think we did talk about his case in our immigration law portal and immigration and refugee law, because it was a thing like, yeah, like kicking out this man out of the island and out of the country, out of the country. And it was like, covered in like McLean's and all, and like all of the major papers and stuff. But I hope it does really renew interest in Cindor and like gets people to like get interest in, and that interest protects him and allows him to reintegrate into society and to reunite with his family. So thank you for making the film, and I thank you to Cindor. If Cindor watches this, thank you so much for sharing your story and speaking with us and sharing it with the world. I think it's important. Like, it boggles my mind. Like, when you think of everything that has happened a lot politically, like how integral he was to it, I'm like, yeah, dude, like,
yeah, agreed.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Lena.
Thank you so much,
thinking
Carolyn.
about it, my brain is just like hurting.
No, we just came out of a great screening, and actually Cindor's son joined, which was really touching. And people seemed to really get it. They were heartbroken for Cindor and his son. They were touched. They were incensed. And so I am hoping that the film does help him. And I hope that it helps him, and I hope that it helps spark conversations about, you know, the world we want to live in.
And hopefully immigration policies in Canada is not as what people think it is.
No, it isn't.
Thank
you so much, Carolyn. You too, dear.
You're welcome.
Take care.